This is the story of a one-of-a-kind Great Lakes steamer. No other Great Lakes vessel was designed or constructed like her. Yet there is a connection between this unique steamer, the Carlton, and this most famous, ill-fated Great Lakes freighter, the EDMUND FITZGERALD. Other than the fact that both were at one time chartered by the Columbia steamship lines, they have a couple of other connections. What are those connections? Let's find out. The answers may surprise you. Our story begins at this unique steamer's birthplace, Buffalo, New York. And the year 1903. The vessel was constructed at the Buffalo Dry Dock Company. However, it was designed by S.R. Kirby of Detroit. Named the Marquette and Bessemer No. 1, it was a mix of a railroad car ferry and a bulk freighter. Its purpose was to ferry coal across Lake Erie from Conneaut, Ohio, to Ontario. The boat was 255 feet in overall length, 44 feet in beam, and 21½ feet in depth, allowing her to use the Welling Canal if needed. Let's examine some of those one-of-a-kind lakeboat features. She had the stern of a standard Great Lakes Railroad car ferry that allowed her to back into any railroad slip of the era and have rail cars pushed aboard. Uniquely, she had one single, huge cargo hatch on her deck. Extending from her engine room bulkhead to her forward cabins, this hatchway measured 144 feet long and 28 feet wide. Atop that hatchway were two sets of standard railroad tracks. They extended from the forward end of the hatchway all the way aft to the edge of her stern. These tracks allowed railroad hopper cars to be rolled directly onto the boat's deck and over the open hatchway. Operation of loading was as unique as the vessel itself. Here we see a cutaway of the vessel's hull. Let's clean this up a bit. There. Now we can see the empty cargo hold and the hatch cover. In order to load the vessel, they first had to remove the chains holding the tarps that kept the hatches water resistant. With those tarps removed, the hatch could now be cleared. The hatch covers consisted of 4 sections of timbers, each being 36 feet long and hinged so they could be lifted and folded away, like this. Now that the cargo hold was wide open, railroad hopper cars filled with coal were rolled aboard. Their hopper doors were opened, and the coal simply dropped into the hold. The short distance of the drop reduced breakage of the coal. That was important in those days. To unload the cargo, the hatches were again opened. Then the rails and their attached ties were hoisted off the deck in sections by use of 4 removable derrick masts. Standard shoreside unloading rigs then extracted the coal. The bow of the vessel was a standard lakeboat configuration. Oddly, this rail-equipped vessel never transported any railroad cars across the lake. She was not equipped with any means to secure rail cars when on the open lake. The Marquette and Bessemer No. 1 was launched on the afternoon of Saturday, November 14, 1903. Miss T.A. Sauer, a stenographer employed at the Buffalo Dry Dock, did the christening. The boat was equipped with 2 triple-expansion steam engines. Fed by a single boiler, the engines were placed in individual housings on each side of her aft hull. Each engine was drafted with an individual smokestack, which gave her a grasshopper-like appearance. It's important to note that although I've seen modern sources nickname her the Grasshopper, I've never found any historic use of that moniker. Marquette and Bessemer No. 1 opened the 1904 shipping season for the Port of Buffalo as the first vessel out on April 25th. She was under the command of Captain Robert McLeod and headed for Conneaut to load coal. When she arrived in port, it was discovered that the new dock at the railroad slip had been built incorrectly, and she was unable to secure to it. Thus, the new boat had to sit and wait for several days as workmen modified the dock before she could come in and take her first load. Thereafter, she functioned quite well in her role. So unique was her appearance that it won her a photo in the Detroit Free Press's Marine page. She was said to be the only boat of its kind in the world. And that was indeed true. Her only real accident took place on Saturday, October 26, 1918. A thick fog hung over the southeastern lakes and actually shut down the traffic on the Detroit River for about 12 hours. Out on Lake Erie, the Marquette and Bessemer No. 1 was making her normal cross-lake coal run when she collided with what was described as, quote, the French trawler Manitone, or, quote, Menatone. One modern source shows the collision as being with the wooden steamer Manitou. However, she was working on Georgian Bay at the time, so that is incorrect. Anyhow, the trawler was badly damaged, and the steel bow of the Marquette and Bessemer No. 1 was also damaged. This photo is said to show her in dry dock following that collision. By the 1920s, the expanded use of self-unloaders made this hybrid ferry obsolete. In 1928, her owners, the Marquette and Bessemer Navigation Company, elected to convert her into a standard bulk freighter. One of her two steam engines was removed, and her smokestack was relocated amidships. Distinctively, her aft mast was mounted atop an arched truss. The boat's square, flat car ferry stern, however, remained basically unchanged. Also, instead of one giant hatchway, the boat now had 12 9 by 28-foot hatches in two sets of 6, with standard leaf hatch covers. Following the conversion, she continued on her normal Conneaut to Canada runs until the onset of the Great Depression in 1929. From then until 1935, the vessel remained in layup, with the exception of the first week of August 1933. At that time, she made a single grain run into Buffalo and departed back into layup with a load of scrap steel from the Hannah furnace. In 1936, she was purchased by Captain Frank J. Peterson and joined his Saginaw Dock and Terminal Company of Cleveland. On May 9th of that same year, Patterson contracted with Ogilvy Norton's Columbia Steamship Company. Immediately, the Marquette and Bessemer No. 1 was renamed Carleton and painted in Columbia's colors. Her hull was iron ore red, and her cabins were Columbia cream, while her stack was also iron ore red, with a yellow band sporting a red star on each side. Peterson, however, made one small edit to the standard Columbia livery. The red star on the yellow band of the smokestack, which normally carried a C for Columbia, was changed to carry an S for Peterson's Saginaw Dock and Terminal Company. As the Carleton, the little unique steamer found her niche. She often carried pig iron as well as baled junk automobiles. These cargoes were loaded and unloaded by self-propelled shoreside cranes using electromagnets. This work seemed fairly minor until the outbreak of World War II in September of 1939. Suddenly, the free world needed as much iron and steel products as it could get, including the scrap steel that the Carleton carried so easily. The Carleton often unloaded at her namesake port on the west side of the Saginaw River. So brisk was her business that Captain Peterson had her again rebuilt. Now the Carleton was given more modern cabins to accommodate more than her normal crew of 17. Her aft deckhouse was enclosed behind her smokestack, and her aft mast was placed atop that deckhouse. In early 1942, the U.S. War Shipping Administration took over all cargo vessels on the Great Lakes, including the Carleton. She worked hard through the war years, but with the end of the war, there was a post-war recession and a glut of Great Lakes freighters. As a result, Columbia's contract with Peterson was suspended, and the Carleton went into long-term layup. With the boat now under his loan management, Peterson had her hull painted black rather than the Columbia iron or red, and her cabins were painted white rather than the Columbia cream. Interestingly, however, he never changed her smokestack, which remained in the Columbia colors with the white S on the red star. The boat remained idle until November 27th of 1954, when she sailed up to Detroit for winter layup. She opened the 1955 season on the 18th day of April and operated the full season as a subcontractor to Columbia Steamship Lines. The steel industry was heating up, and Columbia needed every extra vessel they could find. She sailed the full season of 1956 and 1957 as a subcontractor to Columbia. Before the start of the 1957 season, Columbia consolidated their fleet and bought the Carleton from Captain Peterson. She was painted back into their colors, and Captain Ronald Hannison was replaced with Columbia's newest captain. His name was Ernest McSorley, and the Carleton was his first command. He ran the Carleton through the 1957 season. Her normal port of call was her namesake town on the Saginaw River. Although the docking accommodations were crude, there was a good bar just up the road, and the crew of the ship were always happy. 1957 would be her last season. On the first day of December, McSorley and his crew guided her up past Port Huron, around the Thumb of Michigan, down Saginaw Bay, into the Saginaw River, and tied her up at her namesake port. Through the entire 1958 season, she rested there, near the rail cars filled with old baled automobiles. Many boat watchers suspected that her career was likely finished. Then on November 3rd, 1958, Columbia made the official announcement. The most unique vessel ever to sail the Great Lakes was headed for the Scrapper's Torch. Originally it was said that she would be cut down to a barge, but that never happened. She was towed to Duluth, parked in a dry dock, her internal woodwork was burned away, and her metal workings were scrapped. So now you may be asking, what's the connection to the Edmund Fitzgerald? Of course, it is Ernest McSorley. But there is another strange fetter about this little steamer. You may recall that Captain Robert McLeod was the boat's first commander. He perished aboard the car ferry Marquette and Bessemer No. 2 in a December 1909 mystery sinking that will never be solved. Captain Ernest McSorley was the vessel's last commander, and he perished aboard the Edmund Fitzgerald. So, both her first and final captains were lost with later vessels. McLeod was lost in one of the most mysterious shipwrecks, and McSorley was lost in the most famous. And now you know all about the one-of-a-kind Great Lakes steamer and her assorted connections to the Edmund Fitzgerald.